y'all ask your questions over in the comments section there so that everyone can kind of see what questions you might have. Just as we get started, hi guys, my name is Christine Anderson. I am the Public Affairs Specialist for the Texas Real Estate Commission and the Texas Appraiser Licensing and Certification Board. Hi Laredo, how you doing? Oh, hey Gabe. Hi, how are you? I know you, Gabe. Anyway, we are starting these live events, trying to get the word out about important topics that might be of interest to our license holders, and try to share really interesting and good information in a new way. These Facebook Live events are great because you guys can ask your questions of us as they come and as our staff breaks down certain topics. So today's session is going to be on all things appraisal complaints. We have two of our experts here to talk about that. And our staff is going to be able to answer questions in the comment section, as well as we'll take some of your questions live. So keep those questions rolling in as we start. But just in case you don't already do so, make sure you follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Those social media handles are shared on our website so that you can get regular updates from us throughout the month. We also have a newsletter that we share once a month at the beginning of the month, and please make sure you sign up for that and manage that so that you can get all the latest from the Appraiser Board. And I think it's time to turn it over to the experts, because you guys don't need to sit and listen to me talk all the time. So with me this afternoon, I almost said this morning, is our Director of Enforcement, Troy Beaulieu, and our staff attorney, Mark Lee, who are here to talk today about how the complaint process works. I'm sure some of you maybe have experienced or heard information about the complaint process, what it's like to get a complaint. And we're here just to kind of break it down for you and maybe see if we can make it a little bit more understandable, and also maybe clear up any misconceptions that might be out there about the process. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Troy. All right, guys, here you go.
Thanks, Christine. We wanted to take some time, give you a little bit of an explanation about what the complaint process looks like, try and demystify things a bit, and then answer any questions that you have. So when you do have a question, please write in and we'll try and answer some of those. We'll also have some time at the end of this for some question and answer. Let me give you just real quickly a brief overview of the complaint process so you kind of understand, and then we can drill down into some specifics. The complaint process is kind of broken down into stages, if you want to think of it that way. So the first thing that happens when we receive a complaint is it goes through an intake process. And all that means is that we're going to get a complaint form from, whether it's a homeowner or a bank or an AMC, we get, from all different people. We actually process it to make sure that we have jurisdiction over the complaint, that the complaint really is against an appraiser, because a lot of times people are confused about the correct state agency to file a complaint on. In fact, just last month we got a complaint about an air conditioning company advertising. And that agency that regulates them has similar initials to the Appraiser Board, TALCB, and so they got confused. So we check for jurisdiction to make sure that it's actually an appraiser complaint, that they're not just complaining about value, because obviously we don't take complaints that involve just value. And so that process goes through the legal support staff. So the legal assistants actually look at the complaints and then have the attorney and then myself review it. So after we've determined that, yes, this is a potentially valid complaint, then we've got to basically give people notice of the complaint. So we send out a packet to the appraiser that says, we've received this complaint. We don't know if it has merit yet. We're going to go through the process. But before we do, we want to get the appraiser's response to the complaint. So we need to see the work file, the appraisal report. We have a questionnaire that we have them fill out that has basic information about the appraisal assignment. And then the appraiser can explain to us in their own words in a narrative their response to the complaint. So once we've sent that notice and had a chance to get the complaint response back, and I will say we give people 20 days to respond, and we also provide extensions when necessary. So if you get a complaint and you're on vacation or you're unexpectedly in the hospital or had a death in the family, send us an email. Main thing is don't just ignore the complaint. Let us know what's going on and we'll work with you. We're not going to be unreasonable and expect you to respond to a complaint, if something's going on. But for good cause, we can give you more time to respond to the complaint. Once we get that response, we can finally assign it to an investigator. And it gets assigned to one of our investigators who are all certified appraisers. And they're going to look at the complaint, your response, the work file, the actual appraisal report, and they're going to do their own investigation, their own research into the market data. They'll talk to the appropriate people, so they may call you at some point. They may call the complainant, talk with the homeowner, different things like that. Eventually, the investigation is going to conclude, and it's going to come to the legal team to resolve the case. Now, thankfully, most cases, most complaints get resolved because there's no merit to the complaint. They're dismissed. And that's roughly about 2/3, about 66 to 70% of all our complaints end up just flat out getting dismissed. The remaining group do have some type of issue that the investigator has uncovered that needs to be addressed in some way. And that's where we kind of move into the negotiation phase. So when the investigation is done, if the complaint isn't dismissed, then it'll be assigned to an attorney to negotiate and talk with the appraiser or their attorney, if they've hired one, about how to resolve the case hopefully by agreement. And that's the vast majority of the cases where we do have disciplinary action. They get resolved by agreement. It's very infrequent that we're not able to work out a case by agreement and have to go to the court system. In fact, say for example, this year so far, we've only had to actually take one case all the way through the court process. So hopefully most cases get resolved by agreement. They're reduced to writing so that it reflects the parties' agreement. Whether it's taking some additional education or working with a mentor or whatever the agreement is to remedy the problems found from the complaint, then it's resolved by agreement. Like I said, if we can't resolve it by agreement, and we have those instances occasionally, then we go through a trial process basically. Just like most other state agencies, we utilize the State Office of Administrative Hearings, and that is basically the court system for complaints filed against people, whether you're an appraiser, an accountant, a doctor, and the complaint gets filed at your state agency that regulates you. That's where all the cases that don't get resolved by agreement go. And basically, SOA, the State Office of Administrative Hearings, has trials with an administrative law judge who's an attorney, and they basically hear the case. They listen to both parties' arguments, any witnesses anybody wants to call, any documents that need to be introduced. For example, like the appraisal report is a very common document that we would introduce in the case to show the appraisal that we're claiming has problems or USPAP violations. And that judge is basically going to be both the judge and the fact finder and issue a written decision. After that trial is over and everyone's had an opportunity to make their case in court, the judge has 60 days to issue a decision. And that written decision gets sent to everybody, and eventually it comes in front of the board, and the board is the one that will finally dispose of the case based on the judge's findings, and will issue what's called a final order of discipline. So that's kind of the process in a nutshell. What I'm going to do now is turn it over to Mark Lee, and Mark's going to talk a little bit more about the process, kind of get into a little bit more detail. Mark?
Hi, thanks, Troy. I think there's unfortunately, a common misconception that we are here to go after appraisers, and that's simply not the case. We obviously have our job to do, but our real mission is to protect the public and the Texas economy by making sure that we have an educated and well-versed and active appraiser force. And it may help to understand how we think and what our philosophy is when it comes to negotiating, as you were mentioned before, about some of the orders to resolve complaint cases. And really, we just want to try to be fair, treat everybody who's in a similar situation the same way, and have a balanced approach to protecting the economy and not being overly burdensome to the appraisal practice. But I think it helps to put in context why we're here in the first place and what our reason for existence is, which is the financial problems that we've had in the past. The finance, insurance, real estate, rental, and leasing sector is the largest sector in the Texas economy, as broken down by Statista, which is an online site that has a lot of information about the state and the country's economic engine. And that's about just over 14% of the entire Texas economy. It's 217 billion 2009, it's called GDP dollars. So you can see it's a fairly large amount of the economy that's at stake and is being affected by the practice of appraising. So that's a real concern for us. And back in the 80s, we had the first financial crisis with the savings and loan bailout. There was more than 1,000 savings and loans and 1,600 banks that either failed or had to be rescued in that crisis. And believe it or not, the majority of those was not in California, it was right here in Texas. So we keep that in mind. And then, of course, we didn't learn our lesson the first time around. We had to do it again in the 2000s. And in that crisis, there was an article in the Appraisal Buzz that just came out recently, and they noted that we're 12% behind where we ought to be based upon the projection of the economy back in 2007 because of the damage that was done during that crisis, which was in large part real estate related. So those are the concerns that we have. We want to make sure we don't repeat those. We want to learn the lessons and make sure that our appraisers are valuing our real estate market properly, and that bank loans have sufficient collateral that there won't be a problem. So that's our perspective, is we want to make sure that we protect that really vital segment of our economy by doing things properly. Now, the real truth of the matter is most of the appraisers out there, the vast majority of appraisers out there, are doing good jobs. They work hard, they give valuable objective inputs, and they help drive that engine. And unfortunately, it's 1%, literally less than 1% of appraisers who have disciplinary problems. And so that 1% is impacting the rest of the 100%. And so we try to focus on the really sloppy or the unethical appraisers who are the real danger to the real estate market. And even with that being the case, we barely have enough staff to do the job that we do now. We have over 150 cases, but only 2 attorneys. You see us both sitting here. And we have currently 4 investigators, although we're slotted for 5. We don't have the luxury of pursuing cases because we have some vendetta. That's just not possible. So I hope we've dispelled some of the negative impressions out there that we're out to get appraisers, because we certainly aren't. We just don't have time to.
Do you mind?
Please.
Hey guys, sorry, we're in a tight quarters this afternoon, so I'm just gonna step in and check in with everyone as Mark and Troy are going over this information. If you guys have questions or thoughts on what they're talking about, please, by all means, post your questions in the comment section. Bring up topics that you want us to talk about. We're here to kind of answer your questions. We have our 2 experts here for you live answering questions. So by all means, interject and let us know what your thoughts are on what they're talking about. I know that I myself have always been kind of overwhelmed with all the aspects of the complaint process. I know there's lots of steps involved, and I know that you guys are truly the experts when it comes to this. So thanks again for taking some time out of your day. As Mark said, there's only 2 of them, and they're taking their time to be here to kind of answer your questions. So by all means, we'll continue on, but I just thought I would step in and remind everyone that you guys can talk to us whenever you want. We're here, and we're here to answer some questions. Also, I want to let you guys know that I shared in the comment section a link to our complaint process chart, the page of how to file a complaint, that kind of explains some of the details for any of your maybe clients that are interested in that process, or fellow appraisers that have reason to file a complaint. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Troy. I just wanted to step in and say hello, and back over to Troy. Or Mark, I'm not sure. Troy, Mark, Troy?
No, but that, like I was saying, just with that perspective in mind, we hope you understand that we're doing the best we can to try to resolve our complaints and work the cases out, and professionally to try to work with you and get what you need. If an appraiser has a particular weakness, then we do our best not to try to become over to heavy-handed, and just find out what those weaknesses are, get you some training, and get you back out there, because we want the good ethical appraisers out there doing business. And everyone can afford to learn something. We typically read cases all the time and try to do the best to stay up on our legal side, and we just want to help you guys along in making the same kind of assessments and choices in taking appraisal cases that you can do well and be prepared, and perhaps get with some of our mentors when you have questions or concerns, and get your jobs done.
Okay. Hey, Mark, on that, we have a question from one of our attendees, and they wanted to know, how do we determine if value? I thought that was an interesting question, and maybe you or Troy would like to answer it.
Yeah, I can answer that. So like I mentioned earlier, we do not take complaints solely based on value. So the complaint form, and if you check out the link Christine just sent you there, you can look at that and see the complaint form has several questions on it. And a couple of those questions ask them to specifically explain why they're filing the complaint. And so if the answer that we get back is, well, I'm unhappy with the value, or they didn't appraise it high enough, or didn't make my deal work, that's not a valid basis for a complaint, because appraisers are exercising professional judgment, and we want them to do that. You know, if an appraiser decides the property's worth $155,000 and another appraiser thinks it's $150,000, well, nobody's that good. I mean, there's reasonable professional appraisers can differ. What we're focused on is whether there are actual problems with the appraisal. And chiefly that's the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP, that I'm sure most appraisers are familiar with. And what we're looking at is, was the correct process followed? Did the appraiser employ recognized methods and techniques? Are they really using and relying upon market data correctly? Do they know how to do an income approach correctly? And are they documenting the file and the appraisal report correctly? So for example, if the complaint says, I disagree with the value, I think it was too high, and the reason for that is because the appraiser all used these comps that were on the golf course in the superior neighboring subdivision instead of using it in my subdivision, where 70% of our complaints get dismissed. That doesn't mean that those 70% were frivolous. Frivolous in the law is a different, much higher standard than just there was no merit to this. Somebody could file a complaint and have a potentially legitimate complaint, and we look into it, and at the end of the day say, I can see how you might have thought this and might have thought there was an issue, but when we actually looked at it, there's not merit. That's not frivolous. Frivolous is, hey, we can prove this person knew when they were filing it that there was no merit to this, and they were doing it anyway. And that's a much higher standard. So at times it can be difficult to prove that. And like I said, right now the legislature has only provided us with the opportunity to pursue frivolous complaints if they're filed by another appraiser who has that expertise.
Right. So in Brian's case, a realtor that, might be upset about, value or, and they just want someone to complain to, you guys can't say those are frivolous because they're not an appraiser, unless, of course, they're also an appraiser.
And again, those same complaints coming from realtors would go through the same intake process. So if they don't state a potentially valid complaint on its face, if they only complain about value, we will not open it. Now, if they say, I think the appraiser didn't collect the correct sales data, didn't account for salient features, my client's property is superior because of these features that weren't considered, well, that's a potentially valid complaint that we have to look into.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, Brian, I hope that answered your question. If you have any follow-up, go ahead and post that on the comments section. And then we have one more from Megan Bennett. The complaint I received Monday has a different version of my report attached. They did not use the final revised report. Is it possible that the complaint could be thrown out after you view my final report?
We see this situation a lot. That's certainly possible, right? Because we all know lenders and AMCs have a QC process, and there's a dialogue and exchange between appraisers and their clients through the QC process. And so sometimes, for whatever reason, the complaint we receive may not be the last iteration of the appraisal report. And we look at that holistically. So we're not going to just sit in a vacuum and ignore the fact that, hey, maybe a revised report was issued. So as part of the investigative process, we will account for that and look into that before we make any decisions.
And is that something you see? You said you see this regularly?
We see it occasionally. I don't know about regularly, but certainly it comes up where for whatever reason, the person filing the complaint doesn't send us the final version of the report. That it's, maybe a version that was submitted to the client, but then as they go through the QC process, they make revisions and changes.
And how often, going back to the frivolous discussion, how often have you ever been able to prove a case to be frivolous?
I've been here since 2005, and I can think of maybe one or two instances. It's pretty rare.
Yeah.
Because it's a very high burden. And I think that's because the legislature is very reluctant for people to be afraid to file complaints.
Discouraging that.
We want people to have the opportunity to have an avenue for their grievances. Basically.
Well, and ultimately what sometimes I run into is people making the assumption that our main goal here at the agency is we're there to protect the consumers from our license holders, right? So the bad ones, the 1% that you guys were talking about, right? So it is our job kind of to take those and take all of those complaints and just consider them and make sure that there isn't anyone that's taking advantage of a consumer that maybe just doesn't know better. So sometimes it's hard to think that way because we are the licensing entity. So sometimes people make the assumption, well, you guys are here to serve us, but really it's their clients.
Well, and it's a balancing act because we're charged with protecting the public. License holders are a part of the public.
That's a fair point.
A component of the public.
Right.
But at the end of the day, that's right. We're charged with making sure that appraisers are meeting the minimum professional standards and complying with the law.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, there are some things we can do to assist appraisers specifically, and that's if you have a complaint or a problem with an AMC, get taken off their panel for what you believe are unfair or inappropriate reasons, you can file a complaint with us. We do regulate AMCs now as well. If you think that you're not being paid customary reasonable fees, you can bring that to our attention. If they're not paying you timely within the 60 days, bring that to our attention. And if you think you're being pressured to reach certain results or values and your independence is being impinged on, then bring that to our attention. Those are all ways that we can help you.
Okay. Do you guys have anything else part of your presentation that you wanted to talk about while we're live?
Sure. One of the things I think both Mark and I, if we have a few minutes, would like to talk about, it's one of those things that you may have heard about and there may be some misinformation about, is we wanted to talk for a minute about the evidence process that we actually go through when an investigation is complete and how we determine whether we have enough evidence to decide that we do need to take some type of disciplinary action, because that's really serious for us. We don't take it lightly that this, an appraiser's license is their livelihood. And so if Mark would take a few minutes and could explain a little bit about evidence, direct and circumstantial evidence, and how that relates to some of the comments we've heard about extraordinary assumptions.
Sure. Direct evidence is something that's like eyewitness testimony, photographs, videotapes, a sound recording. Those are all directly related to the event, and so they're called direct evidence. Then the other side of that is called circumstantial evidence. For instance, if you get pulled over for speeding and somebody sees blood all over the front seat and there's a knife in the back and you're sweating and nervous, and a few days later they find your wife's body laying out in a field full of stab wounds, then those would all indicate that probably or at least there's a good chance that those are all related and that you may have murdered your wife. But none of those things individually say that you murdered your wife. So in situations like that, it's often the circumstantial evidence, the little bits and pieces that together add up and create a probability that we end up having to use or that we rely on. It's particularly applies to state of mind evidence. You can't really read someone else's mind. So the way you try to figure out what they were thinking is by their actions. So their actions would be circumstantial evidence as to what they're thinking.
Well, and like Mark said, just like with the example about the murdered wife, we weren't there the day that appraisal was done. We don't know what analytical and development processes the appraiser went through. But we can look at the appraisal report, we can look at the appraiser's work file, and we can interview the appraiser and other people involved in the transaction and see the circumstances surrounding that and reach conclusions about it, just like a police officer would do, like Mark described.
Right, and that's the thing, is our investigators are really, that's their main role. Their main function is to be investigators. It just so happens by design that they're also appraisers. Many other states do not have appraisers as their investigators, and they have robust, compliant regulation programs. We think it's more helpful to have somebody who's an expert who can give a better opinion about what's going on. That gives us a more informed basis on which to make our decisions. So it's extremely helpful, but it's important to keep in mind that their main function is to investigate the case. The appraisal side of it is just an extra ability that they have, which makes them more effective investigators. So when you talk about extraordinary assumptions, the contrast between the appraisal side of things and the investigator side of things is an appraiser can make assumptions in coming to their value conclusions, and the investigators make one. They basically assume that the information that's contained in the reports is true and correct. But when it comes to making a conclusion, a legal conclusion based upon the evidence they find, that's really driven by the process called inferences. And witnesses and fact finders throughout the country and every courtroom context, whether it's administrative proceedings, criminal proceedings, or civil litigation, you're permitted to make reasonable inferences from the evidence you have to then draw a conclusion, which is your result. So that's the process they go through. They try to gather all the evidence, They make reasonable inferences from that evidence, and then they draw a conclusion. And under the law, direct evidence and circumstantial evidence are given the same weight. There's no difference in the law between a piece of circumstantial evidence and a piece of direct evidence.
Well, and a perfect example of that is we may have a complaint where somebody says the appraiser didn't consider deferred maintenance and serious deficiencies in the condition of the property. And as we start to investigate, the appraiser says, oh no, I considered all that. We weren't there. We didn't see whether the appraiser inspected the property, and we weren't inside their head when they analyzed it. But if we find that they haven't photographed any of the deferred maintenance that is clearly there, we get photographs from the homeowner that show them. There's an inspection report that was available from a real estate inspector showing all kinds of problems. And we determine, looking in the appraisal, there's no discussion of any of that in the appraisal. Then we start to have pieces of circumstantial evidence that suggest the appraiser probably didn't really analyze that. So the investigator is not making an extraordinary assumption by concluding that the appraiser didn't analyze that deferred maintenance. In fact, it's not extraordinary, it's a very reasonable assumption to make. So that's something to keep in mind, that their role as an investigator is maybe a little bit different than their role as an appraiser, and that you can have these instances. It's very common to have circumstantial evidence. It's not necessarily direct evidence. The investigator wasn't there watching someone do the appraisal, but it's still we still may determine that there are problems that need to be addressed.
Well, I think that's really interesting, you guys, that you're pointing this out. I know as a common person, I don't necessarily always understand the difference between circumstantial and direct. So I appreciate that, especially as somebody that buys and sells or buys real estate and has a home. It's always interesting to kind of hear how that process works. And thank you for taking the time to explain that to us. We have a couple of more questions.
Sure.
Guys, I know that we said we were going to end at 3, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but we did have a couple of minutes there where we went out, the internet went out. So I'm going to let this go over a couple of minutes just so that we get our full amount of time here with our experts. So I'm going to ask a couple of more questions. Brian did comment about whether or not realtors should be allowed to submit complaints without or with a fee. This is the gentleman that was talking about that. He's saying that they should be held to the same standard as appraisers. I can say that as somebody that works with real estate agents as well as appraisers, the expertise level that appraisers maintain in the process and the appraisal process and value process is much different. Just like an appraiser probably doesn't know the expertise of the family residential contracts, and maybe doesn't have the similar. That's why we need all of those people involved in that process. And I would assume that maybe is what the difference is and why the legislature might consider them different.
Sure, and ultimately that's really a policy issue. So I would say if you feel very strongly about that, you might talk with the policymakers, your state representative or state senator, because they're the ones that would be in a position to change that policy.
Yeah, that's in the statute, correct?
Right, it is.
Yeah, so that's not something that we can necessarily change, but it's something to think about. Mr. Kirkpatrick, if you wanted to ask more about that process, maybe you can reach out to your legislator. Allison Trevino says, second comment or question, are there anything in the works with TALCB for an appraiser to submit a report with or without the possibility of repercussions to determine if the work we are doing is in fact USPAC compliant? Up until now, it seems you don't really know until you have been through the complaint process.
Yes, so we actually have 2 avenues for doing that. One is that we have a new program. It's called a work product review program for appraiser trainees. I recently did an interview with Appraisal Buzz that discusses that. So if you go look at that question and answer session on Appraisal Buzz's website, you can.
And I can share that on the Facebook page
Sure.
as well as on our website too.
So you can actually submit a 1 or 2 page application and pay a $75 fee if you're a trainee. and we will send a sample of your choosing out to one of our AQB certified USPAP instructors who are on the peer investigative committee, and they will give you a written report with feedback with no repercussions. So that's one. The other aspect is we have a list of board approved mentors that is on our website. And I know in talking with many of them that they do provide a service where you can privately contract with them, and they are happy to conduct kind of private consulting
Review.
and look at your processes, look at a sample of your work, and suggest ways to improve or to change your office practices or your procedures.
And I think we can share a link to the the mentor page
Sure.
here in the chat room as we're discussing things. So so you guys can find that list easily. But that's a great service that's available.
And then the third thing I'd throw in is that we periodically give presentations. I just gave a presentation last month, the Austin Board of Realtors. Mark was in Arlington a couple of weeks ago presenting to the Association of Texas Appraisers.
Yeah, we had an investigator there as well, so you get to ask them questions.
So yeah, definitely we try and get out there and interact with folks and share our experiences, what we're seeing in complaints, what we're seeing as problems and things to watch out for.
Oh, great.
Just one other little comment, something that Troy actually told me when I first started working here. He's been here for quite a number of years, longer than I have. And he said, you have to think of appraisals as like second grade math, that one of the most important things you can do is show your work. That, the opinion has to be supported by relevant evidence and logic. And the more information you have, the easier it is for us to understand the process you're going through. So even if there is a mistake or a problem, we can, for one, help you out with what we think you should be doing. And two, it reassures us that you're actually getting the information and maybe just had a mistake interpreting it or didn't know that a particular method. So it makes it a lot less serious problem for you. It gives us a good feeling that you're working hard and trying to do your job.
Okay. So Megan says, okay, it was a non-intended user claiming to be an appraiser that filed the complaint. I think this is the person that got the complaint, or I still need to go through the whole process. I think she's asking, does she still need to go through the whole complaint process if it was a non-intended user claiming to be an appraiser that filed? Excuse me.
Yes. So unless you hear from us in writing that you do not need to submit a response to the complaint, you'll want to follow the instructions in the complaint notice and provide us your written response, a copy of your work file, and your appraisal report. And when we definitely realize there's two sides to every story, and I have had situations where witnesses or people complaining had not been 100% truthful. So we're definitely on the lookout to make sure we're verifying and documenting and finding evidence before we're not just leaping to conclusions. Right. So we want to hear your side of the story and get the whole picture before we take any action.
Because it's more work on your end to keep going.
Right, right. If there's an easy way that we can resolve the complaint and say, hey, there's no issue here, then not only is that the appropriate thing to do, but it saves us a whole bunch of paperwork and time and effort. We've got plenty of other really serious issues. And when I say serious, it's things like, well, we need to call law enforcement because this is so serious. So we would much rather be focused on people who are lying and cheating and stealing and harming the public and the integrity of the profession than dealing with, at best minor issues or issues that are really non-existent.
So I've had a couple of questions about whether or not, so if somebody doesn't have Facebook, can they attend these sessions? What we'll do is we'll post this video on our YouTube channel and reshare it so that you can share it with anyone that doesn't have Facebook or that you think might find this interesting. We are looking at other ways to have interactive sessions like this. We're wading into the pool using Facebook Live as it's an easy platform that we assumed a lot of people would have access to. It's not perfect though. So we'd love to hear your feedback about your thoughts on this platform and how we can improve, and even other topics that you want to hear about. We're going to continue to provide these types of sessions to our license holders as often as we need to. So if you have an idea, please be open and share that on our Facebook page or here, or email us, and we'll definitely take that into consideration. Okay, so somebody asked if we are going to do this for a TREC complaint process, and I think based on the feedback from you guys, that's definitely something that we can do, and we'll look into that for the future. Be sure to like both the TALCB Facebook page as well as the TREC one, and we'll advertise that event as we get around to planning that. So I think, unless you guys have anything else to talk about.
No, I just wanted to thank everybody. It was great talking with y'all today, answering some questions, addressing the process. If anybody ever has any questions, feel free to call our office or email us.
Yeah.
We're available. We're approachable. We want to help people understand the process and make this, it's not always a pleasant process, but we want to make it as easily and as simple as it can and answer any questions.
They're two really nice guys, I promise. So with that, we'll go ahead and sign off, and thanks so much for everyone for attending. Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Good job, guys.